I should have known from the moment I walked into that coffee shop that Gary was different from the other guys I'd been dating. He was sitting there with his worn-out jeans and this ratty old sweater, reading an actual newspaper like some kind of hipster grandfather. And I remember thinking he was either completely broke or one of those weird minimalist types. Either way, he was gorgeous in that rugged, slightly weathered way that men get when they hit 40. So I figured I could work with whatever his situation was. When he asked me out, I made sure to establish right away that money wasn't important to me. I'm not one of those women who cares about fancy restaurants or expensive gifts, I told him during our second date, watching his shoulders relax like I just lifted some invisible weight off them. I've been married before, and I learned that genuine connection matters way more than bank account numbers. It was exactly what he needed to hear, and honestly, it felt true at the time. He seemed sweet and stable, riding his little bike everywhere and talking about his modest house like it was some kind of sanctuary. I figured he was probably a teacher or maybe worked at a nonprofit, something noble but financially unrewarding, and that was fine. I could be the supportive girlfriend who appreciated the simple things in life. Those first 3 weeks were actually pretty perfect. Gary was attentive without being clingy, funny without trying too hard, and he had this way of listening that made me feel like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. We'd go for long walks around his neighborhood, which was nice enough, but nothing special. And he'd point out different architectural details on the houses, like he was giving me a personal tour of some hidden gem. His own place was this tiny 2-bedroom thing that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s, but he clearly took care of it. The yard was immaculate, everything painted and maintained, just small and basic. I started mentally calculating how much it would cost to renovate, figuring we'd probably want to upgrade once things got serious between us. He'd pick me up on dates in this ancient Honda that had to be at least 15 years old. But again, it was clean and well-maintained. I appreciated that he wasn't trying to impress me with flashy displays of wealth he didn't have. There's something refreshing about a man who's comfortable with his limitations, who isn't compensating for financial insecurity by putting on some fake show. I told my sister that I'd finally found someone genuine, someone who valued experiences over material things. She seemed skeptical, probably because my track record with men hasn't been stellar since my divorce. But I felt confident that Gary was exactly what I needed. The shift happened on a random Tuesday evening when I was over at his place making dinner. We were talking about weekend plans, and I suggested this new restaurant downtown that everyone had been raving about. It's supposed to be amazing, I said, but probably pretty expensive. Maybe we could split it, or just do appetizers? I was trying to be considerate of what I assumed were his financial constraints. But he just laughed and said cost wasn't really an issue for him. That's when he casually dropped the bombshell that completely changed everything. He owned his house outright, had paid off the mortgage years ago despite buying it when he was practically still a teenager. His father Oliver had helped him arrange the financing when he was 17, some kind of family investment strategy that I didn't fully understand. But the bottom line was that he'd been building equity for over 2 decades, while most people our age were still figuring out their careers. And he didn't work, because he didn't need to work. Smart investments, he said, like it was no big deal. Early retirement through careful planning and discipline. I'm standing there stirring pasta sauce, trying to process this information while maintaining my composed expression. But inside my brain is completely recalibrating everything I thought I knew about this man. The modest house isn't a limitation. It's a choice. The old car isn't financial necessity. It's some kind of philosophical statement about not being materialistic. The bike riding and simple lifestyle aren't signs of struggling to make ends meet. They're the habits of someone who has enough money that he doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Suddenly, I'm seeing our entire relationship through a completely different lens, and I'm not sure whether to be impressed or annoyed that he's been essentially playing poor this whole time. Here I've been mentally budgeting our dates and suggesting affordable activities like some kind of financial advisor, when apparently he could afford to take me anywhere I wanted to go. The realization is simultaneously exciting and frustrating. Exciting, because obviously this opens up a lot of possibilities I hadn't been considering, but frustrating because he's been letting me operate under completely false assumptions about our situation. After that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the implications. We could travel together, really travel, not just weekend road trips to nearby cities, but actual vacations to places I'd been dreaming about for years. We could go out to nice restaurants without me having to worry about whether he could afford his half of the bill. I started researching couples' trips to Europe, looking at those luxury river cruises that always seemed impossibly expensive, imagining what it would be like to actually have a partner who could make those dreams reality. I began bringing up these possibilities in casual conversation, just to gauge his reaction. Wouldn't it be amazing to do one of those wine tours through Tuscany? I'd say, or I've always wanted to see the northern lights in Iceland. He'd nod and agree that those sounded like wonderful experiences, but he never took the bait and suggested we actually plan anything. It was like he was determined to maintain this facade of modest living, even though I now knew better. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. If he had enough money to retire early, exactly how much were we talking about? Was this a situation where he could afford a nice vacation once a year, or were we talking about real wealth, the kind that could change both of our lives significantly? I deserved to know what I was working with here, especially if we were going to get serious about our future together. So I started asking. Nothing too direct at first, just casual inquiries about his investment strategy or how he'd managed to pay off his mortgage so young. But Gary would deflect or give vague answers that didn't really tell me anything useful. It was starting to feel like he was being deliberately evasive, which seemed ridiculous given that we'd been dating for over a month at that point. We were clearly moving towards something serious, so why was he being so secretive about his financial situation? The first time I asked directly, we were at dinner at that expensive place I'd originally suggested. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd ended up taking me there anyway, and when the bill came, he didn't even glance at it before handing over his credit card. "So," I said, trying to keep my tone light and conversational, "how much money do you actually have, and how much have you invested?" It seemed like a reasonable question between two adults who were clearly developing feelings for each other. But Gary got this uncomfortable look on his face and started talking about relationship stages and appropriate disclosure timing. "I don't think we're at a stage of our relationship where we should be asking each other things like that," he said, like I'd requested access to his medical records instead of basic information about his financial situation. I smiled and nodded and said I understood, but honestly, I was confused by his reaction. We're both divorced adults in our late 30s, not teenagers fumbling through our first relationship. What's appropriate if not honest communication about the practical realities of building a life together? I backed off for a while, but the questions kept nagging at me. He'd mentioned smart investments, but what did that mean exactly? Stocks? Real estate? Some kind of family trust situation? And when he said he had enough money to not work, was that enough for one person living modestly, or enough to support a family comfortably? These seemed like legitimate concerns for someone who was starting to envision a future with him, but every time I tried to bring it up, he'd give me that same speech about timing and relationship milestones. The whole thing was starting to feel like a game, and not a particularly fair one. He knew everything about my financial situation because I'd been transparent from the beginning about my post-divorce circumstances, my job, my modest savings account, my concerns about retirement planning. But apparently his money was some kind of state secret that I wasn't worthy of accessing until we hit some arbitrary relationship benchmark that he'd never bothered to define. I tried different approaches. Sometimes I'd be casual about it, working financial questions into broader conversations about our goals and dreams. Other times, I'd be more direct, explaining that I was trying to understand his lifestyle and priorities. I even tried the emotional route once, telling him that his secrecy was making me feel shut out of an important part of his life. but no matter how I framed it, his response was always the same. Too soon, not appropriate, need to take things slow. It was becoming increasingly frustrating, especially as I watched him spend money without any apparent concern, while simultaneously acting like his financial details were classified information. He'd casually mention dropping $2,000 on some investment opportunity, or he'd surprise me with expensive wine at dinner. But God forbid I ask how much he actually had to work with. The contradiction was maddening. By our 6th week of dating, I was starting to lose patience with his evasiveness. We were having dinner at his place, and somehow the conversation turned to retirement planning. I mentioned that I was worried about having enough saved for the future, especially after the financial hit I'd taken in my divorce, and suggested that maybe we should start thinking about our long-term financial compatibility. It seemed like a mature, responsible thing to discuss. But instead of engaging with the conversation like a normal adult, Gary started getting defensive about privacy and boundaries. The discussion escalated, and I'll admit I raised my voice a little bit. Not yelling, exactly, but I was definitely frustrated with his refusal to treat me like a partner worthy of basic information about his life. Here I was trying to have a serious conversation about our future, and he was acting like I was some kind of gold digger trying to get my hands on his precious money. I tried to cool things down immediately because I could see that my tone had surprised him, but the damage was already done. He got quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the evening, and I could tell he was reconsidering our entire relationship based on one moment of frustration. It felt completely unfair. I'd been patient and understanding for weeks while he played his mysterious millionaire act, but the second I showed any real emotion about his secrecy, suddenly I was the unreasonable one. The worst part was that I genuinely liked him. When I met his friends Lauren and Christy and Barry the following week, I could see why he valued their opinions. They were warm and funny and clearly cared about him, and I enjoyed spending time with all of them. They seemed to like me too, which felt validating after the tension that had been building between Gary and me over the financial discussions. For a few hours, I could almost forget about the money situation and just enjoy being part of his social circle. But even during that pleasant evening, I couldn't completely shut off the part of my brain that kept wondering about his financial details. These people had known him for years, so they probably knew the real scope of his wealth. Were they in on the secret that he was keeping from me? Did they think it was reasonable for him to be so evasive with someone he was supposedly developing serious feelings for? I wanted to ask, but obviously that would have been inappropriate and probably would have gotten back to Gary. Instead, I focused on being charming and likable, showing them that I was someone who could fit seamlessly into his life. I laughed at Barry's terrible jokes and complimented Christy's cooking and asked Lauren thoughtful questions about her work. By the end of the evening, I felt confident that I'd made a good impression, which seemed important for the long-term success of our relationship. At least if things got serious between Gary and me, I wouldn't have to worry about his friends disapproving of his choice. But the financial secrecy was still eating at me. We'd been dating for almost 2 months at that point, which felt like more than enough time to establish trust and openness about important life details. I wasn't asking him to combine bank accounts or make any major financial decisions together. I just wanted to understand the basic parameters of his situation. Was that really so unreasonable? I decided to make one more attempt at getting the information I needed. The following weekend, we were spending Saturday afternoon at his place, just relaxing and talking about random topics. I brought up the subject as gently as I could, explaining that I cared about him and wanted to understand all aspects of his life, including his financial philosophy and planning strategies. I thought I was being mature and thoughtful about it, approaching the conversation from a place of genuine interest rather than nosiness or greed. But Gary's reaction was immediate and final. He said he felt like his privacy was being invaded, that we hadn't reached any kind of relationship milestone that would justify the level of financial disclosure I was requesting. He talked about how money had ruined friendships and family relationships for him in the past, how people's attitudes changed once they knew about his wealth, how he'd learned to be careful about who he trusted with that information. Then he said he thought we should end our relationship. Just like that, 8 weeks of dating terminated, because I'd asked reasonable questions about his financial situation. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to invade his privacy, that I was just trying to understand him better and plan for our potential future together. I got emotional, probably more emotional than I should have. But I was watching my entire romantic future disappear because this man was too paranoid to treat me like a trusted partner. He was gentle but firm about his decision. He said he could see that we had different expectations about appropriate boundaries and disclosure timelines, and he thought it was better to end things before we got more invested in each other. As if I hadn't already invested 2 months of my life in getting to know him and building something meaningful together. As if his comfort with secrecy was more important than my need for honesty and openness in a serious relationship. I left his house that day feeling completely blindsided. What was supposed to be a casual Saturday afternoon had turned to the end of the most promising relationship I'd had since my divorce. And for what? Because I'd asked my boyfriend of 2 months to be honest about his financial situation? Because I'd wanted to understand the practical realities of building a future with him? The whole thing felt surreal and deeply unfair. The worst part is that I genuinely believe I was right to ask those questions. We're not college kids playing house. We're adults with real responsibilities and concerns about the future. If he was serious about me, if he saw potential for something long-term, then financial compatibility and transparency should have been part of our conversations. The fact that he was so defensive about it suggests that maybe he wasn't as committed to our relationship as I thought he was. I've been replaying our entire relationship in my head, trying to figure out where things went wrong. Maybe I should have been more patient, waited for him to bring up financial topics on his own timeline. But how long was I supposed to wait? 6 months? A year? At what point does patience become enabling his need for excessive privacy? I feel like I was reasonable in my expectations and approach, but apparently that wasn't enough for someone who values secrecy over partnership. The really frustrating part is that his friends apparently think he overreacted. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Lauren and Christy and Barry had mixed opinions about his decision to end our relationship. Some of them thought he was being immature and unnecessarily secretive, which validates my feeling that I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. Even the people who know him best think his boundaries around money are excessive and potentially damaging to his relationships. But of course, Gary is too stubborn to listen to feedback, even from people whose opinions he claims to value. He's so convinced that his approach is the right one that he can't see how his secrecy might be perceived as lack of trust or commitment by someone who cares about him. I was willing to be patient and understanding, but I wasn't willing to be kept in the dark indefinitely about something as fundamental as his financial situation. Now I'm back to dating apps and awkward first dates, trying to find someone who understands that real relationships require honesty and openness. My retirement planning is back to depending entirely on my own modest savings and whatever I can manage to accumulate over the next 25 years. The future I was starting to envision with Gary has evaporated because he couldn't handle basic questions about his wealth. I know some people would say I should have been more patient, that 2 months isn't long enough to expect complete financial transparency. But I disagree. We're not talking about sharing social security numbers or combining assets. We're talking about basic information that affects major life decisions. If someone can't trust their partner of 2 months with general information about their financial situation, what does that say about their capacity for intimacy and partnership? I think Gary is probably going to struggle with relationships until he learns to balance his need for privacy with the legitimate expectations of women who are interested in building something real with him. You can't keep someone at arm's length indefinitely and expect them to stick around waiting for you to decide they're worthy of your trust. At some point, Secrecy starts to look like selfishness, and patience starts to look like settling for less than you deserve. So here I am, single again at 39, trying to figure out how to find someone who can handle adult conversations about money and the future without getting defensive and paranoid. Maybe Gary will realize he made a mistake, maybe his friends will convince him that his reaction was excessive, but honestly, I'm not holding my breath. Someone who ends a relationship over basic financial questions probably isn't ready for the kind of partnership I'm looking for anyway.